Hi, everybody. My name is Daniela Caruso. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Europe. And tonight it is my pleasure to introduce to this center two wonderful scholars and also a fundamental topic, climate change and the way we're going to deal with it through the Green Deal, new or not new. We have as a presenter today, Professor Henrik Selin here. He joined the Boston University faculty in 2004 and is presently an associate professor and associate dean for studies in the Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies, as well as a faculty member of the Center for the Study of Europe and a fellow with the Pardee Center for the Study of Longer Range Future. Professor Selin's research focuses on international environmental cooperation and policy making in a broader context of advancing sustainable development. His most recent books are Mercury Stories, Understanding Sustainability Through a Volatile Element, co-authored with Noël Eckley-Selin, and European Union Environmental Governance, co-authored with Stacy van der Veer. Professor Selin is also a Hans Fischer Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at the Technical University of Munich. His areas of expertise include international environmental politics, sustainable development, global governance, and international institutions, and of course, the European Union. Professor Miriam Allena joins us today from Milan, where it's 10:30 p.m. Thank you very much also for that. She's a law graduate, summa cum laude, of Catholic University of Milan, where she also received a Master of Laws. And then she went ahead to gain a PhD in administrative law from the State University of Milan. Today, Miriam Allena is full professor of administrative law at Bocconi University in Milan, where she has been teaching courses in administrative law, environmental law, and global administrative law. She has held visiting appointments at the Law School of UC Berkeley, at the University of Oxford, and at the Law School of NYU. She has also been appointed permanent fellow of the Common Room at Wolfson College, again at Oxford. Professor Allena has authored 2 books and many scientific contributions, both in Italian and in English, on topics that include environmental law and public law of economics. Last year, she published the article Blockchain Technology for Environmental Compliance Towards a Choral Approach on the Environmental Law Review. So it is my pleasure to give you the forum, Henrik.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you very much to the Center for the Study of Europe here at BU for hosting this. And definitely not least, thank you very much to Miriam for being the discussant here today. So I did prepare a little presentation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about EU climate change politics and policy, basically asking the question, is this a case of leadership or is this a case of failure? So I will structure it that I will start with a brief background to the European Union, especially as it pertains to the climate change issue. Then talk a little bit about what the EU has been doing on climate change. And last, talk a little bit about the future when it comes to climate change governance within the European Union in the context of a European Green Deal. And then I very much look forward to a discussion with Miriam on some of these issues, as she is very much an expert on similar issues, but might come at it from a slightly different angle than I do. As Daniela mentioned, a couple of years ago, I did co-author a book with Stacy van der Veer, who is at UMass Boston, called European Union Environmental Governance. So some of the earlier stuff that I will be talking about here about how the EU works in the area of environment and climate change will largely draw from that book. So currently, of course, we have 27 member states. That used to be 28, but with Brexit, we're down to 27. So in many ways, the EU is a group of 27 countries working together and also working in conjunction with a growing number of EU bodies that I will also say a little bit more about. And if we're looking at the history of the EU, I would argue that environment more broadly and climate change more specifically have been a major area of institution building within the EU. As in, I don't see neither climate nor environment as a niche area, but rather as an area that has been central to building the kind of European Union that we are seeing right now. And then also looking forward, climate change, as Daniela mentioned, is very much central to this idea of a European Green Deal. And then also, last but not least, the European Union is also the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases after the United States and China. So what the European Union does on climate change is not just important in Europe, but is important globally. So if we're then thinking about the European Union as an increasingly complex governance structure, it's helpful to just quickly go through some of the major bodies of the European Union, as I will get back to several of these later on when we get into the details of what the European Union has been doing on climate change. So one of them is the European Council. So that is the heads of states and governments that meets at fairly regular interval, and where the presidency then rotates among the various member states on a 6 months basis. Now, this is not so much as a decision-making body as it is a discussion body, but a discussion body at the very highest level. So some of the goals, the overall goals on climate change and energy that I will talk about a little bit later, has been discussed and agreed on within the European Council. Then we have the European Commission, which is the bureaucratic arm of the European Union. So all international organizations have the equivalent of a secretariat. But I think what is very important to remember here is that the European Commission is not your regular secretariat. It is a fairly large bureaucracy that also have a fair amount of political power. And among them is that all legislative proposals, EU legislative proposals on climate change originate from the European Commission. It is a bureaucracy that has been given the power to initiate legislative change. The European Commission is also structured similar to the way that you would structure a national government, as in you have the sort of equivalent of the president at the top, and then you have a bunch of commissioners that sit on their issue portfolio. So they are all responsible for a particular issue area. Now, some of these portfolios are a little bit more central and others are a little less central. And with a growing number of member states, and each member states insisting on having one commissioner, means that they have also had to invent new portfolios moving forward. But during much of the 1990s and early 2000s, then climate change was decided or fell under the authority of the Commissioner on the Environment. But in 2010, they established their first Director General on climate. So there is then one person with an environment portfolio and then one person with a separate climate portfolio. And I think that that's an indication of how climate change grew in importance within the European Commission. And the current one is Frans Timmermans, who is not only DG for climate, but also the first vice president of the entire commission. So it's not that they're giving the climate portfolio to the most junior person. In fact, this time around, it's one of the more senior people within the commission and a very seasoned European politician in Frans Timmermans, who has climate as their responsibility. Then we have the Council of the European Union, which is where the member states engage in policy making. So if the European Council is the heads of states and governments of the European countries, then the Council of the European Union are the ambassadors to the European Union of these member states. So this is where member states negotiate policy and new laws within the EU. Then we have the European Parliament. Since 1979, they have had directly elected MEPs in the various countries in debates and policymaking. And one other thing that is very important to the climate change story within the European Union is the growing influence of the European Parliament. As in, over time, the European Parliament has gotten more and more of a role to play on climate change governance. And importantly, in many areas, it's the European Parliament that have wanted to go further than the member states. So the European Parliament has helped to increase the ambition on climate change and other environmental issues within the EU. And then last but not least, and I'm not going to talk much about that here today, is the Court of Justice in the European Union, which then rules on authority and on implementation. Because in contrary to other intergovernmental organizations where there are relatively few penalties if a member violates the rules, there can be much more far-reaching consequences for a member state that does not meet its commitment, EU commitment, including on climate change. So the EU is very much a treaty-based organization. So everything that it does related to development of new law is based on the powers that are given by the treaties that set up the EU as a whole. And of course, the first one was the Rome Treaty in 1958. Now, that did not contain the word environment. You can read through the entire Rome Treaty, but the word environment doesn't appear. So then one of the conundrums for the member states in the Paris summit in 1972, when for the first meeting where they were gone for the original 6 to the original 9, when they launched environmental actions, what should be the foundation? Since the treaty did not mention the need environment, there was no clear basis for developing environmental policy within the European Union. However, that Rome Treaty contained language on improving living conditions and promote integration. And that was the legal basis that the member states in the 1970s then used to take some of the earlier actions on environment. None of this was on climate, it should be noted. It was on other types of chemicals policy and more sort of pollution related policies. And these early actions were then also supported by the Court of Justice. So when the Court of Justice was asked, is there in fact a legal basis for the EU to take action on the environment in the context of improving living conditions and promote integration, the court said yes. Then in 1987, we got the Single European Act. And since 1987, there have been a very explicit treaty-based legal basis for creating environmental policy, including on climate change. So the SEEA, the Single European Act, explicitly mentions the environment as one of those areas where the EU have authority to develop policy. It also introduced majority voting among countries. Now, the EU is a very, very consensus-oriented organization. So also on climate change, they are really going out of their way of always trying to reach consensus among the member states. But there is always the threat that if, for whatever reason, consensus is not possible, they can pass climate change legislation by qualified majority among the member states. And the Single European Act was also one of the first instruments that really helped strengthen the parliament. And as I mentioned, the European Parliament has typically played a relatively green role within the European Union. And the 2009 Lisbon Treaty outlines then the current decision-making rules. So just to summarize a little bit. So what we then have here is we have treaties, we have frameworks, and we have directives, right? So the Lisbon Treaty is then the EU-wide treaty that creates the current legal foundation for all legislative action, including on climate change. Then we have lots of climate and energy policy frameworks that have been discussed within the European Council among the members, the heads of states and governments, that outlines major ambitions and goals. Then we have the specific legal instruments, the directives that target specific policy areas. And then the procedures for decision-making are then shaped by the 3 levels of competences that currently exist in the EU under the Lisbon Treaty. So the first, that's where the EU has exclusive competence. That's where the EU bodies alone take actions. So a common trading policy, for instance. So in the World Trade Organization, the European Commission representatives and others speak on behalf of the entire European Union and negotiate on all member states. Then we have the second, shared competences, where new laws are negotiated between EU bodies and member states. And this is then where environmental policy falls. This is where climate change is. This is where energy issues. And then we have the third, where the EU merely provides supports to member states, so on healthcare, education, industry policy. That's where member states still retain almost all of the sovereign rights to make their own decisions. So we are then putting climate and energy in this middle ground where there is a shared competence. And that's sort of just an important background to remember when thinking about how the EU is currently developing climate change policies. And here's just a scheme of how those directives where there's shared competence is being negotiated. I'm not going to go through the entire. If the ordinary legislative procedure happens to be a particularly keen interest of you, you can go and look it up in that paper. But I'm just going to say now that, as I mentioned earlier, all legislation originates out of the European Commission. Then it goes to both the member states in the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament, and then back and forth we go until the member states and the European Parliament agree. And another thing that I think is important to bear in mind, especially if you're then coming from outside Europe, is to recognize that once the European Commission proposes a new legislation, it's almost a given that something will get passed. As in, it's very, very rare that the Commission proposes a new law and then member states and the Parliament fail to come to an agreement. This then in contrast here to the United States and especially Congress, where a legislative proposal can fail and die at any moment until it's actually been passed. It's never certain that Congress passes a law until it's actually been passed. Within the European Union, it's slightly different because it is such a consensus-oriented organization. Now, sometimes this can really drag out and it can be very extensive negotiation, but something almost always comes out of that process. So with all of that at the back of our minds, then look at some of the early EU action on climate change here. So the EU got invested in climate change in 1991. So what that means is that since this is 2021, this is the 30th year anniversary of EU policy making on climate change. So this is something that the organization have now been doing for 3 decades. And I think that that goes to my earlier point that this has been an important part of institution building within and not necessarily ever growing organization, but an organization that have grown quite dramatically over the last 30 years. So in 1999, the Commission issued a strategy that aimed at limiting CO2 emissions and improve energy efficiency. And those early EU efforts were fairly modest. They did pass a directive to promote electricity from more renewable energy sources. They entered into a voluntary commitment with car makers to reduce CO2 emissions by 25%. And there were some proposals on the taxation of energy products. So taken together, this does not amount to much, but it does sort of signal that this was an area where the EU was now going to get involved. And one thing that is, I think it's important to remember here, if we go all the way back to the 1990s, that one of the earlier proposals that was on the table by the European Commission was to create an EU-wide carbon tax. So the Commission argued, well, we have a problem with CO2 emissions. We need to reduce them. They come from many different sources. If there's something that we know in the European Union, it's how to tax things. The social democratic or the welfare states more broadly in Europe are very much built on effective taxation and the raising of public money. So there was this idea that let's just pass an EU-wide carbon tax. However, if we go back to those different areas of competence, it's important to recognize that taxation is not an EU right. The setting of taxes is still very much done by countries on an individual basis. So there were some countries that were skeptical of a carbon tax, but there was also a large number of then member states, then 12 member states, and then 15 in 1995, that opposed the idea of a carbon tax on principle, because they really did not want to give taxation authority to the European Union on carbon tax, because then you didn't have to be a genius to figuring out that if the European Commission managed to squeeze that through, they could then very easily go back and say, well, we have an EU tax on carbon, so why don't we have an EU tax on this and an EU tax on that and an EU tax on that? So member states agreed that this was largely something that they wanted to have as very much a national authority. So they pushed back fairly hard to the European Commission. So that means that the European Commission and the member states then need to think about other things to do rather than using taxation. And another thing that happened in the 1990s was at the global level, the international community, including the European Union, came together and negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. And under the Kyoto Protocol, the then 15 members of the European Union agreed that they should cut their greenhouse gas emissions by 8% from 1990 levels by 2012. And here's another important aspect of climate change action within the European Union. So one option would have been to say, the EU 15 needs to cut their emissions by 8%. Therefore, each member state cuts their emissions by 8%, and voila, the collective goal of reducing our overall emissions by 8% is met. This, as an idea that all countries reduce their emissions by exactly the same amount that is similar to whatever the collective goal is, was fairly roundly rejected by a number of member states, especially the less wealthier member states in, at that time, Southern Europe. So therefore, climate change negotiations in the European Union, going all the way back to the 1990s, is very much a story about parallel negotiations. On the one hand, they are negotiating what should the collective goal be. Should we reduce our collective emissions by 8% or 10% or 12% or whatever it should be? And then at the same time, what should then individual countries do towards meeting this collective goal? So there's this burden sharing agreement on cutting CO2 emissions by 2012 that was negotiated as part of EU law to figuring out how to get to the collective goal of an 8% reduction. And then, as I mentioned, the basic principle here is wealthier member states taking on a greater responsibility. So if we go all the way back to the late 1990s, in 1998, and then look at the various targets that individual member states took on, we see there's a wide variety. So on the one hand, Luxembourg agreed to cut its emission by 28%, and Germany and Denmark agreed to cut their emission by 21% in support of the 8% reduction goal. Then, at the other end, Greece was allowed to increase their emissions by up to 25%, and Portugal were allowed to increase their emissions by up to 27%. So it was not just a question of how much should each member state cut their emission, but it was negotiation about which countries should cut and which should be allowed to see their emissions increase in support of economic development in less wealthy countries. And then the idea was to stitch all of this together. So if the math added up for all of these numbers, the overall reduction would be 8%. And then as part of this, the EU then joined the Kyoto Protocol in 2002. And then the EU, one of the things that we've been seeing within the European Union is that they have increased their goals over time. They have gradually ratcheted up their commitments. So the next major step came in 2009, when, as the lead up to the negotiation in Copenhagen in 2009, that was supposed to result in a new global agreement, but largely failed. The EU entered into that with what they're known as their 20-20-20 by 2020 goals. So rather than reducing their emissions by 8% by 2012, they increased that to a 20% reduction below 1990 levels by 2020. They then also introduced other goals. So they should also have 20% of total energy consumption from renewable sources by 2020. So all the energy consumed in 2020, at least 1/5 of that should come from renewable sources. And then the idea was then to reduce primary energy consumption, as in they should become more energy efficient. So compared with projected trends, there should be a 20% reduction in primary energy consumption by 2020. So it was not just a question of setting goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also setting goals for expanding renewable energy and setting goals for energy efficiency. And then the 20% greenhouse gas reduction was then submitted under a 2009 Copenhagen Accord, which was a political agreement stitched together at the very last minute. And then leading up to the 2015 Paris Agreement, the EU raised its goal even further, and now with a 2030 deadline. So the current goals right now is that there should be a 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. And the goals on renewable energy generation and energy savings was originally set in 2015 at 27%, but were then later increased. So for renewable, it's currently 32% by 2030 and 32.5% on energy savings. So this is sort of just give you a set or sort of a sense of how the EU have increased their goal over time. So what is it that the EU have then does? Well, since the idea of a carbon tax failed, a cornerstone in climate change policy, as developed through various directives, is the establishment of the EU emissions trading scheme. And this is then part why this was passed is that whereas a carbon tax required consensus by all member states, and some refused to give that authority to the Commission, to EU bodies, an emissions trading scheme could be established under the qualified majority voting that was introduced in the Single European Act that sort of then acted as a threat. Now, member states passed this legislation by consensus, but there was this idea we need to reach consensus because if we don't, some kind of emissions trading scheme can be passed anyways. And just as a side note, one of many ironies in climate policy, I would argue, is that when world's countries were negotiating the Kyoto Protocol that was then adopted in 1997, the United States was actively pushing emissions trading as an important policy. And initially, the EU was very, very skeptical of emissions trading. They thought it was way too market-oriented. It was just a way that some countries could basically buy themselves out of responsibilities. And it just sort of did not fit with the European model of decision-making in the 1990s. That was still very much in a more command and control kind of approach as to let's leave it to the market and let the market figure it out. Today, however, by far, the most elaborate emissions trading scheme anywhere in the world exists within the European Union. So having gone from a very, very skeptical actor on emissions trading, they are now one of the ones that are most strongly arguing for the virtue of emissions trading for dealing with climate change. So the EU ETS has developed through a series of phases. So we are now in the fourth phase of expanding the emissions trading scheme that is the cornerstone for reducing greenhouse gases within the European Union. So it includes all EU members, plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. So 27 plus 3 is 30. It then used to be 31, but with Brexit, the UK left. So now the UK has its own emissions trading scheme, and there are provisions in the Brexit agreements that were signed between the UK and the EU that the UK system can be linked to the European emissions trading scheme. So for reasons that are at least somewhat unclear to me, it was important enough for the the current government in the UK to be independent in the sense that they absolutely insisted on having their own emissions trading scheme but then seem to be open to link that as opposed to the more simpler method of simply just being part of EU ETS, but that's just a side note. So what this then does is that it sets a regional cap covering all of these 27 countries for 3 distinct greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the most important one, but has then been expanded over time, so also nitrous oxide and fluorocarbons are included in the emissions trading scheme. This covers over 11,000 industrial point sources, plus more recently airlines that also operate within the system. So if you have an airplane that flies from one EU member to another EU member, emissions from that trip would then also be covered under the emissions trading scheme. And then the idea here is to gradually shrink the cap and then make sure that all of those entities that are covered are buying allowances to match their emissions. And then when you then shrink the cap, you're then reducing the total amount of allowances that exist in the system. When you reduce the total amount of allowances, prices go up. When prices go up, incentives for reducing CO2 emissions goes up as well. So right now, the cap is 21% lower, was 21% lower in 2020 compared to in 2005. And then starting this year, that cap will shrink by 2.2% annually. So the annual shrinkage is the overall cap has then been built in for the next 10 years. And then this covers roughly 40% of EU's total greenhouse gas emissions. So there's one sort of single approach that covers 40, but that then also means that 60% of EU's total emissions are outside this and are then targeted by then other policies on renewable energy, efficiency, transportation, and so forth. So having now talked first a little bit about sort of how the EU works in terms of climate change governance and some of the goals and policy instruments that exist, I want to sort of end by looking a little bit about progress and the Green New Deal and some of the challenges that the EU faces moving forward. So there has definitely been some progress, but I think that one of the take-home messages is some progress, but ways to go. So on the good news, the EU will exceed the 2020 target on greenhouse gas reduction. The numbers here are from a report by the European Environment Agency. So the European Environment Agency is located in Copenhagen in a very nice address right next to the French embassy, right in the center of Copenhagen. And that is basically then the agency that is tasked with, among other things, monitoring EU greenhouse gas emission, producing the technical reports, and basically collecting the data to see if the EU is on track to meet their goals or not. So all of the numbers here are the official EU numbers. So the EU 27, since we're now minus the UK, in 2019, they were 24% below their 1990 levels. And then with the pandemic hitting and emissions going down, at least temporarily, it's clear that the 20% reduction goal for 2020 will be met. At the same time, the EEA also points out that further action is needed to meet the 2030 target of 40%. The EU is not there yet. The EU will also meet its 20% renewable energy target by 2020. In 2019, they were a little over 19%. And again, with measures already built in, they will be right around 20% by 2020. But again, the further action will be needed to meet the 32% target by 2030. Unlike the other two 2020 goals, the third one will not be met. So the energy efficiency goal will not be met. Too many states are behind their individual goals, because remember, this is then another area for both renewable energy and energy efficiency goal, where we have this approach of burden sharing, as in we are figuring out first, or at least in parallel, what the overall EU target is going to be. And then we're then trying to figure out what individual member states should do in support of the overall target. And if we're then looking at the individual goals of individual member states and energy efficiency, too many of them are behind their national targets, so that if we tally all of that up, the EU collectively will not meet its 2020 energy efficiency goal, and then it's then even further behind of meeting its 2030 target. So a mixed bag. That, however, is not deterring the European Commission and the member states and the bodies from moving forward. We are currently right at the very, very end of trying to consolidate a new climate law. So in March of last year, the Commission proposed a new climate law that was explicitly linked to this idea of a Green Deal. And the overall goal here is that the EU should be climate neutral by 2050. And if the EU should be climate neutral by 2050, then the existing goals leading up to 2030 is not enough. So in September last year, the Commission added that by 2030, the EU should not reduce their emissions by 40% as previously agreed, but increase that to 55%. In October, after the Parliament voted in favor of increasing that not from 55 but to 60. So again, Parliament showing its green chops here, and sort of a practical illustration of how the European Parliament in many ways have acted to increase ambitions on EU climate change goals. However, in December, the member states reached an agreement on the original proposal of 55% reduction coming out of the Commission, as opposed to the 60% reduction asked for by the Parliament. So right now, we are in the very final stages of negotiations between the member states and the Parliament to figuring out what the actual target, the new actual target for 2030 should be. But whether it ends up at 55 or 60 or somewhere in between, it's still a significant increase in ambition from the previous target of 40%. So let's look at some of the successes here. So the EU-wide greenhouse gas emissions are on a clear downward trajectory. Greenhouse gas emissions in Europe are going down. Individual member states also have relatively low per capita emission when we compare to other industrialized countries in the world. So if we look at EU on average, then the EU average per capita emissions is 9 tons per person, whereas the equivalent number here in the United States is 16 tons. So that means that per capita emissions are almost half, not quite, but almost half of the emissions here in the United States. But some individual member states have per capita emissions that are much lower. So Sweden's per capita emission, for instance, is close to 4 tons. And that's not just only significantly lower than the EU and much, much lower than the United States, but it's also much lower than per capita emission in a country like China. So Sweden's per capita emissions are close to half of the per capita emissions in China, and especially since Sweden's emissions are going down and China's emissions are going up. So especially some European countries are doing really well in a comparison with other major industrialized countries anywhere in the world. Also, the EU very much struggled to launch the emissions trading scheme. For a long time, the carbon price was very, very low. There were too many allowances, and they just could not figure out or reach political agreement on how to make it stringent enough that it was a major reason for why European emissions were going down. However, in the most recent, in the fourth phase that started this year, they have figured out at least some of the kinks. And very recently, as in earlier this week, I think it was, or was it late last week? I can't remember. For the very first time, the price for a carbon allowance, which is 1 ton of carbon, reached over 40 euros. And when we get up to 40 euros and 40 plus, that is a price high enough that a lot of the larger emitters are going to find increased mitigation fairly attractive also from an economic perspective. And the idea here is then, with a shrinking cap of over 2% per year, that the price of allowances will continue going up. And if it goes up to 50 tons or 60 tons, then the ETS could finally become a real driver of significantly pushing down emissions further in Europe. And the total renewable energy production is expanding. So I would say those are all successes. Shortcomings. The EU currently does not have the necessary policy measures to meet the goals for 2030 and 2050. So 2 out of the 3 goals for 2020 was met. But what's on the books now is not going to be enough for the higher ambition goal for 2030 and the goal of net neutrality in 2050. Much more is going to be required. And then there are real differences in ambition levels across member states moving forward. There are those that want to advance much more aggressively, and then there are those that want to move more slowly. So there are significant disagreements among at least some of the member states that it's not a given that the EU will march forward as one on a number of these, especially then on issues on energy, renewable energy, coal use, natural gas, including buying natural gas from Russia. So there are a number of energy and climate related issues where there are deep and important disagreements among member states. And this is then related to the fact that there has been limited progress on implementing what they call the Energy Union, which was launched in 2015. Now, some of that is more technical issues about energy security and transmissions, sort of try to increase transmissions of energy across member states, integrating electricity transmission and so forth. But it's also about what role should nuclear power play? How quickly should we phase out coal use? What is the best way to ramp up renewable energy production and so forth? So that's sort of my way of trying to say that there are both political and technical hurdles to further expanding zero carbon energy production that have to be overcome if the EU wants to meet its goal. And then I have so far talked almost exclusively on climate change mitigation, as in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But climate change will also hit the member states of the European Union. Some member states are located in the Arctic, others are located around the Mediterranean. Now, their adaptation needs are going to be very, very different, but they all going to have to adapt to a changing climate. And exactly how to do that, both at the regional level, but at the national and local level, is something that none of the member states of the European Union have really figured out. So there will be a lot of head scratching and trial and error on figuring out an effective way to adapt to a changing climate. And here's just a figure that again comes from the European Environment Agency. So it's an official EU figure coming from one of their reports that sort of shows the challenge of becoming net neutral by 2050. So on the left, you then see what the European Union have done over the last 30 years. And yes, the trajectories are going in the right direction. But if you see how relatively little they have done over the past 30 years, and then you see on the left what is needed for the European Union to be doing over the next 30 years, I think that that sort of really illustrates the magnitude of the challenge. If the EU only managed to do that much the past 30 years, how will they be able to do the very, very deep cuts that are needed over the next 30 years to get to the 2050 goal that the European Commission and member states and bodies want to write into EU law through the new climate law? So then finally, returning to the overall question, are we seeing a case of leadership or are we seeing a case of failure? And I would say it depends on your perspective. The European Union have done more than other industrialized countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So they are clearly a leader among the world's industrialized countries. So if we look at the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and others, it's clear that the European Union have done more than those, and in some instances, much more than those. They also already on the books have relatively ambitious goals, and they have managed to increase them over time. So both of them would sort of be arguments in support of the leadership point. However, the EU have also clearly not done enough to put Europe on a clear path to decarbonization. It's a little bit of a mystery of how that 2050 goal will be met. It will largely have to be met using policies and other initiatives that currently does not exist. So the question is, will the EU somehow manage to get their act together over the next 30 years? And that is also important because the EU, even if they are a leader among the industrialized countries, they have not done enough in support of the Paris Agreement's collective temperature goals. So the Paris Agreement of 2015 is very clear. Global average temperature increases should be no more than 2 degrees Celsius. And all the world's countries should work together to try to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, both of those goals already unfortunately seem out of reach. But if we're then thinking about, for the sake of argument, let's say that we are going to work really hard towards those 2 degree Celsius goal, given that the fact that the European Union is the third world largest emitter of greenhouse gases, at almost like 1/10 of all the world's greenhouse gas emissions are coming from Europe. What does the European Union need to do in order to do its fair share? It's clear that they need to do more than what they have done so far in order to get us at least a fighting chance to come close to the 2 degrees Celsius target. And a major hurdle here, and this is the last point I'm going to make, is that high consumption lifestyles remain intact across Europe. And in order to get to carbon neutrality in 2050 and meet the Paris Agreement's goals, there are more and more experts that are arguing that this is not just about policy. This is not just about new technology, but this is lifestyle changes. And then the question is, will Europeans, not the European Union or European countries, but Europeans, will they be willing and able to engage in the kind of lifestyle changes that will be collective lifestyle and individual lifestyle changes that are needed in order to make sure that the EU meets that goal of carbon net neutrality around 2050? Or will the Europeans, together with many other relatively wealthy people all over the world, cling steadfastly to their high consumption lifestyle and basically say, well, this is a problem for others, not a problem for me? So that's another area where there are uncertainty. So with that, I will end, and I hope that you think that that was a at least partially hopeful overview of the EU, what the EU are doing, and some of the challenges moving forward. And on that, I am intrigued to see to the degree to which Miriam thinks I'm completely wrong, or the degree to she thinks I'm somewhat right, or the degree to she might even think that I'm completely right on some things, but we shall see.
We shall see.
Thank
indeed.
you.
Thank you so much, Henrik. This is you put a lot of material on the table. Thank you, and it was a tour de force. Please, Miriam, take it away.
Thank you very
Agree,
much.
disagree.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you especially to Henrik for this, I would say, great, very informative and inspiring presentation, which puts a lot on the table. So I have a few comments, and then we can discuss some of your conclusions as well. So as to the comments, so starting from the last part of your presentation, you mentioned the fact that the goal that the European Union has still to reach in order to meet the 2050 goals are quite huge, and it is to some extent a mystery on how this goal will be met, will be achieved. At the same time, you mentioned in your presentation, you to some extent mentioned the EU Green Deal, which is, let's say, the new program, the new action plan, which aim at making the EU economy sustainable and to reach the what you mentioned, so the climate neutrality by 2050. So, of course, the EU Green Deal means providing more clean energy, protecting more biodiversity. It means sustainable mobility, or in fact, zero emission mobility. It means climate actions, including adaptation to what are now perceived as being unavoidable consequences of climate change. And overall, it would require a new industrial policy. So the very name of the Green Deal recalls, of course, the New Deal, no, the American New Deal. And so that was a plan which entails a completely new resource allocation. And this is exactly what the European Union would like to do now. So to undergo a completely new way to manage resources, economic resources, in order to reach these goals. And so in order, for instance, to help industries to modernize their activities and to become able to exploit the green opportunities, or to stimulate the development of new markets for climate neutral and for circular products. So a completely change also on lifestyle that you were mentioning at the end of your presentation. The modernization of energy intensive industries, which are the most polluting activities, and the sustainable product policy, which is one of the other main pillars of this Green New Deal. So my first comment on this is, since you are an expert on EU governance, environmental governance, so in your opinion, how this European Green Deal will impact on the overall governance on the one side of the European Union, but at the same time also on the relationship, let's say, governance relationships between the European Union on the one side and the member states on the other side, because we know that the member states will be those that will be required to take actions. So all these plans, provisions, then will need to be implemented by each member state. And so my feeling is that we will face a completely new governance paradigm, or at least in terms of the relationships between the European Union institutions and the institutions of the member states. For instance, my feeling is that probably the role of public authorities will be increased. And so on this point, there is also a connection with the American New Deal. So that this plan, this European Green Deal will not be only a resource allocation, a new resource allocation, but it may entail a strongest, a more important role of a more important intervention of the state, of power of the state, which at least will lead, will driven, let's say, the economic transition. And so that may have also some consequences from the regulatory point of view. Some scholars have already pointed out the risk that we will have a more complex regulatory framework in the European Union, partly because of the growing number of regulations. Let's think, for instance, of all the regulations on green products. So probably the European Union will need to add regulations in a sector which is already highly regulated. And so this, of course, is not, how to say, well, is not welcomed by the industries, which don't like all these complex and non-flexible regulation. So I probably so my feeling, I'm not an expert on this, but my feeling is that the Green New Deal, the European Green New Deal, will impact on the governance and on the relationships between the European Union and the member states. But it will probably impact also on the role of the private sector, which is a major and high polluting industries, which we may expect, at least at the beginning, to some extent, they will oppose to this transition, unless the European Union and the member states will be very able to, let's say, subsidize these industries in order to drive their transition to the green economy. But we may expect some opposition. And here it comes also the role of the civil society, which again, we don't know how the civil society will position itself. We can say that overall, we can imagine that the civil society will be happy to follow this green transition. But at the same time, and here it comes my, let's say, the second point of my comment, we have also to consider that the transition will not be without cost. And so we may expect that we will have job losses, we will have, because we will need to make this transition. And it is not by chance that the European Union is now has approved and is now, let's say, building the so-called just transition mechanism, which is, again, a plan, a mechanisms which aim at addressing the social and economic effects of the transition, focusing particularly in those regions, let's think, for instance, of Poland, which is the symbol, no? But also many other regions of Europe, which are, how to say, particularly carbon intensive, or which rely more on fossil fuels, and so for them it will be difficult to do this transition. So the idea is to address the social and economic effects on regions, on industries, and on workers. So, by creating, for instance, new jobs, by stimulating public investments on sustainable transportation, improving energy infrastructure, which you mentioned, the European Union is still quite behind its targets, and so forth. So my feeling is that probably all these will impact on the overall European governance. It may also bring some serious issues on the very same European construction, because I mean, we are quite aware of the risk and of the rising populism all over Europe. And of course, the Green New Deal, the European New Deal, Green Deal, could become, let's say, a kind of another argument for populist movement at some point, because of this transition, because the transition will have cost. And so, of course, the enthusiasm towards this transition is high, especially in certain environment. But I think the European Union is also aware of the fact that it will have to face a lot of opposition, not only from the industries, which may be to some extent convinced at some point, for instance, thanks to incentives or public money, so providing public support in terms of economic support, but also on people, which will have to adapt, and not only because they will lose their job, but for instance, just to give an example, because some people will have to change their job. For instance, they will have to adapt to a different job, to a different. So this will, we know that that changes are always difficult, to some extent, and so we may expect that this may cause some issues. So these are the main points that I wanted to echo. There is also a third point that I would like to underline, which is to some extent connected with the previous one. We will probably, I mean, I don't know what's your opinion, your opinion, but my feeling is that we may see more state in the next 30 years. So when you mention the fact that it's a mystery on how the goal of achieving the zero emission, the climate neutrality by 2050, we don't know how to meet it. In fact, my feeling is that, it will not be possible to use only the European emission trading system, which, as you explained, it's to some extent, it's a great construction, which still is not really working well in practice, but at least from the perspective of the construction, it's really huge and important. But I'm not sure that only the European emission trading system will be enough. And so I'm not sure that more in general market mechanisms will be sufficient to tackle this challenge, which is a great challenge. And so probably we will have an increasingly important role of states, governments, institutions, both at European and state level. And so this may bring some institutional changes also on the, on the overall political and economic strategy of the European Union. So if the European Green Deal is a reality, so if it's really something which the European Union wants to achieve and to put in place and to implement, probably this may bring some changes also at a more deeper structural level, both at the EU and domestic, at the national level, state level. And of course, as to the just a final comment on the lifestyle changes, I think this is that you mentioned in your presentation. I think this is very much connected also with the same point: market mechanisms versus command and control, or at least stronger regulatory instruments which entail a stronger intervention of public powers and of governments. I recall, for instance, that in the encyclical of the Pope Francis, the encyclical Laudato Si on the environment, the Pope strongly criticized the market mechanisms for several reasons, also maybe cultural reasons, and so forth. And so, as a consequence of this, the encyclical itself was very much criticized by also by an important line of scholarship, for instance. But I think that the point that the Pope was making in that encyclical, that is the fact that we cannot, to some extent, we cannot think that these goals will be achievable only by using market tools or voluntary instruments. I think this is something that we should really start thinking. And so I'm not talking of the decreasing of the, but at least we have, as you mentioned, we have completely and quite a lot has changed the way we live, also as a Europeans. So that's something which as well may raise some issues for the practical and concrete implementation of the European Green Deal. So these were very much my comments. I don't know whether I made a bit of confusion because I said many things, but three main points. If you want, I can also summarize them or recall them. So the first point is how all these European Green Deal will impact on the governance both at EU and national domestic level. What will be the influence also on the more in general on the regulation? So will we face a stronger regulatory pressure? And the third point was the fact that I guess the third point I said too many things, so I don't remember myself either. The lifestyle changes, which will probably be necessary in order to achieve these goals. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for those comments. I unfortunately for the audience, it seems like you and I agree on a lot of things. I come at this from the perspective of someone who is interested in environment and sustainable development, and then sort of try to figure out EU governance. I would say though, if you are interested in EU governance, you're an EU person, but not necessarily an environment and climate person. I would say climate change should still be one of the things that you should study over the next 10, 20 years, because I think that if we do take that climate goal seriously for 2050, if we take the Green New Deal, then I think that you are absolutely right. We are going to need new governance structures. And I think trying to sort of look at the crystal ball, I mean, I don't know, but I'm trying to sort of think what might happen here. So if we are taking the Green New Deal seriously, I think that that implies, and I think the European Commission is very, very well aware of that, that implies stronger governance at the European level. That involves a stronger European Commission. That involves a stronger council, and it involves a stronger parliament. I think that when the European Commission are saying things like this and really pushing the Green New Deal, I think that they're honest and serious people, and I think that they really believe in this. But I think that at least some of them also see it as a side effect that this would then, in effect, strengthen the pan-European institutions. It's sort of an argument for those that believe in more supranationality rather than less supranationality, that this could be a way of further transferring governance authority to the EU level, away from national parliaments, away from member states. So I can see there being a fairly intensive tug of war of what is it that actually should be decided at EU level, like what authorities should those EU bodies have vis-a-vis what should they be kept at the national level. So for instance, when I talked about the three levels of competences, industry policy is a third competence, right? The EU only have supportive competence there. But if we take, I totally agree with you, if we want a European Green Deal, we're going to need a European revised industry policy, how we sort of approach industrial policy. If you transfer some of that authority to the EU level, that would be a huge change. That's a lot of new authority that you're giving to EU bodies that I can see many countries really pushing back against. So that's where I said, if you're interested in EU governance and relationship between EU bodies and between EU bodies and member states, I think this is going to be a fascinating case to look at the Green Deal and how a lot of this is sort of playing out, because we are going to need regulations. And that is another point where I agree with you. If we take, again, the Green Deal seriously, as far as I can tell, that very much means bringing the state further back in, right? You're absolutely right. The emissions trading scheme is 40% of all emissions, but even that is riddled with politics. If you're going to need net neutrality, you're going to need much more public involvement, whether that is the Commission or national government, or I mean, it's likely going to be a combination of all of that. So I do think that there are at least some of the people who are supporting this idea of a Green New Deal who are seeing this as a way of revitalize the role of the state in Europe, who think that we might have conceded too much to markets and market mechanisms, and it's time to bring the state back in, to bring state policy or public policy in the European, to bring public authority more back into the center. And I'm sure that there are those that are gonna push back on that. I will say this in someone who does not always agree with the Pope on a number of things. This is definitely one of the things where he got it right. One of the things I do like in that communication. It was in 2015, if I remember correctly, right? Yeah. Was that he was talking about both sort of the role of state and structures, but also the role of individually, of individual responsibility. And I think that there are some lifestyle changes that's going to be requiring sort of public policy. For instance, as you're all aware of, taking one of those low-cost carriers like EasyJet or Ryanair or whatever, you can fly from Milan to London for 39 euros on a good day, right? That's not sustainable. That's just not sustainable, right? And the only way that you're gonna get to some of that is through increase the price of carbon, but also having more government policy of sort of steering people towards mass transportation, towards taking trains rather than planes, and all of that. And I totally agree that that's going to need a fairly strong hand of the state to do that.
Great. I would like to raise another couple of points. So one is, okay, so we've seen this with the Commission over and over again. So the Commission sometimes finds a horse to ride, and the horse is going to be ridden really, really fast if the horse will take us to more integration. You know, so there have been stories of consumer protection, you know, changing the rules of contract law in mass consumer transactions that became avenues for the Commission's strengthening. So I very much believe that with all the good idealism, there is also, you know, the project of fortifying itself, which has always been the anchor of the Commission's movement across history. The question will be, will the states be ready to concede as much power to the European Union, right? So I think we're going to see those battles. Now, if the states are on board, then of course within the states, as Miriam said, we're going to see politics because the just adjustment, whatever it was the just transition adjustment
mechanism
is going to be a matter of great political contention. Okay, so definitely more centralized powers, and as a consequence, more pushback at the political level, right? So this is not going to be easy. We're going to see a lot of, but I think that we're missing here. I would like to bring in another piece, right? Which is we are in the School of Global Studies. So if we can bring in other parts of the world, whenever Europe becomes better, right? So it's engaging in greening policies all over the place, there is the specter of European legacies of colonialism. So to say we are going to get green and we're going to reach these really, really ambitious goals by 2050 raises the question, are we coherent in the project of improving the state of the globe uniformly, altruistically, you know, making it for you know, like the Pope has been invoked these times, like the Pope would like, something about the globe, the planet Earth. I am not sure. People who have taken a close look at Mercosur have noticed that the way in which we do trade still is insufficiently demanding of adjustment. In other words, primary sources from other countries, we need them. And of course, it's a balancing act, whether we want them at a very high cost, which would, of course, pay for the greening of other countries, or at a low cost, right? So I am wondering whether studies in environmental law studies in the European Union take account of the specter of green colonialism, as it has been called. The other thing is vis-a-vis the United States, right? So if we can juxtapose the two Green Deals, the one in the European Union and the one in the United States, politically, are they aligned? Or, I am not sure about that. The Green Deal in the United States has taken very particular political connotations. In Europe, it seems to be mixed. Environmental politics at the state level may be in fact in conflict with environmental policies at the European level. I am not sure, so I wonder, for those who study this, what do you think about the impact of a lecture like this that publicizes the ambitious goals of the European Union, albeit tentatively, but it is, you know, sorry, it is a chant of the virtues of the European Union. It's a fantastic ambition. How does that play out when other actors take a look at it, in particular in the United States? And the other one is the Global South. Is the European Union positioned to do things right vis-a-vis that? In other words, is the trade policy of the EU going to dovetail adequately with its trade, the trade policy with the environmental policy? And it's a question for both.
I am happy for Miriam to go first on that one.
No, I was saying that these are very interesting questions, and of course, I don't have a real answer to this. What I can say is that probably the European Union is, I mean, I don't think it's really that much concerned about the issue of colonialism. It seems to me that so far the European Union has been engaged in what we could call a rush towards the top. So the European Union wants to be the leader in terms of environmental law, environmental progresses, and green goals. So, and I think that this is a kind of how to say, it's a rush, you know. On the other side, there is the United States, there is China, there are other countries, and so I think the European Union now really wants to achieve this goal of being at the top, of being the leader. And this is something which I notice also in conferences and meetings that there is this idea that the European Union is now leading, for instance, environmental policies, and while in the past it was perhaps the US, no? And now European Union is consider itself to be at the top. And so, of course, the issue of the trade policies and the issue of the global south. So how will how the European Union will reconcile? There is in the European Green Deal, there is a reference to the fact that the European Union will have to manage the issue of especially for chemical substances which will not be allowed anymore to enter. So certain products that will have that have chemical substances will not be allowed to enter into the European market anymore. And so this is, of course, something which will raise issues. I guess probably these policies will be very much opposed not by the global south, but I guess by, for instance, the United States or other countries that still do not adopt these policies. And so this is actually another big issue of the Green Deal. So how it will be possible to effectively implement these policies while taking into account a broader perspective. So yes, I don't have a real answer, but my feeling is that so far, taking into account so there is a kind of how to say, a narrative that when it comes to environmental law, what it counts is to reach certain goals and to become better, because of course we also have I mean, there is also a kind of responsibility towards, let's say, the global south, and also the global north has some kind of responsibility. So it has to take all actions and so on in order to reduce its environmental impact and so forth. But I think that sometimes this is especially when the European Union tries to reconcile constantly, you know, the protection of the environment with economic goals, and so with the growth and with, of course, this doesn't take into account very much the issues of the global south, because it's. I mean, I'm not saying that it's impossible to reconcile at all, but again, probably the change that we will need to implement are changes much broader than just trying to how to say, to make the economic growth and the sustainability all together. No, so the sustainability now is a slogan in the European Union, which is fit for all. No, but so probably it should be taken a bit more seriously from this perspective.
Yeah, I sort of just building off that, I would say how the European does this at home, to sort of what kind of policies they put in place can have really large ramifications for countries in other parts of the world. And some of these might be fairly negative. So one of the things about climate neutrality and reducing greenhouse gas emissions is the talk about border adjustments, right? So if there are goods that have been produced and and then emitted a lot of CO2 emissions, and then they're coming to Europe, there's going to be a border adjustments. Now, if that then comes from a country like the United States and China, that could be politically tricky, but I'm sort of less concerned economically. But if that then involves countries that are still trying to develop in Latin America or Africa or Asia, that could have negative ramification for their ability to export their goods, which can have a negative impact on their economic growth. We can have a negative impact on their ability to fight poverty and develop along a more sustainable path. So I think it's going to be, I think you're absolutely right, Daniela. I think one of the things we're going to sort of have to keep an eye on is, what does a greener Europe mean for the rest of the world? Because if we get a greener Europe and a sort of browner rest of the world, or if the EU's success is built upon the backs of developing countries, then I wouldn't say that that's a victory for Europe. I would say that that's a failure for the planet. And on the comparison between the EU and the US, yes, I do think that there's definitely similar rhetoric, as in it's about changing societies in a way that makes them greener, but then also develop new jobs, provide more opportunities for people. So it's sort of a win-win situation, both for the environment and the economy and future generations. I am somewhat skeptical about the European Union being able to deliver on all of these very, very ambitious goals. But I will say this, though. I am a little bit more inclined to think that Europe has a slightly better chance than the United States. And I would say that this comes down to how there are still differences in how we view the state. Not everyone in Europe loves the state, that's for sure. But I would say that there is a higher degree of the population here in the United States that see the state as an inherent problem, right? So going back to Reagan, the state is not, the government is not the solution, the government is the problem. If you think that the government is the problem and not the solution, designing a Green Deal is going to be extremely difficult, because as we talked about, this does require bringing the state back in. It requires bringing governments back in. And if you can't find agreement on bringing governments back in, you're not going to get a Green Deal. So I think that the EU might be slightly better positioned than the United States to potentially pull that off, in part because there are different views on the role of the state and the usefulness of the state.
Great.
I agree.
Yeah,
can I add something on
please.
this? I agree with Henrik. We may add probably that European Union could be more successful on this if it will be able also to convey the message of a more state, which is something that, as you said, Europeans are kind of accustomed to, as coming not from the European Union, but from a more inclusive process, no? Because otherwise the risk is again the opposition between, on the one side, the Commission and the European Union and the member states. So I think that the process and the inclusion of the member states, and on this we may think that probably also the Next Generation EU, which is the other big plan which the European Union is now implementing, is now adopting in order to face the COVID-19 crisis. And so the European Union is providing funds to member states, especially certain member states which were particularly affected by the COVID-19 crisis. Again, all this plan is based, the majority of these funds will need to be used for green projects, for green transition, as well as for new technologies, improvements. But the green part of these, it's huge. And so we may think that since these are, let's say, funds, these are money that will came in order to help to rebuild the economies of the certain countries within the European Union, which are actually really struggling because of the COVID-19, and that will probably struggle even more in the next months. So to some extent, we may think that the support of the European Union could be viewed as a support, and so a closer European Commission, a closer European institutions than actually it is perceived. And so, since also the Next Generation EU will be based on environmental transition, that may help as well.
Definitely the link with the present moment with the response to COVID-19 started with Henrik's presentation, when he noticed that while Germany had to decrease its emissions, Greece actually was allowed to raise them. In other words, there is an element of redistribution that is common to these projects, and perhaps the greening of Europe will also bring about more of that, just like COVID has done. And I personally think that's a good thing. So guys, we are at the end of our time. I really appreciate this discussion, the depth of all the issues that you've raised, and I look forward to keeping the conversation alive with the students and with those who watched and with the friends of the center. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you, Miriam, again for staying up so late.
For your comments. Wonderful.
Thank you, Henrik, and thank you, Daniela, for this invitation, and thank you also to the audience.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.